Today, I will present to you what the EU is doing in the field of corporate sustainability policies and due diligence. All right. So slide one. Let's start from the beginning. This is a picture of the investment needs that we have in order to reach net zero by 2050. And what we see is that the numbers that we get from the Climate Policy Initiative and the IPCC are pretty consistent. Climate finance represents over $1 trillion annually right now, but it should be around 8 trillion to put us in line with net zero. And of course, this picture only covers the climate component of the sustainability transition. It doesn't cover other sustainability challenges related to human rights, social rights, and it doesn't also highlight the fact that we also need to reduce climate harmful finance. After all, we know today that we're investing far too much still in fossil fuels. So having said that, what do we do in the EU to deal with that investment gap? So first we have industrial policy, which is not in this slide. Here you can see that we have a whole range of financial instruments that are either dedicated to the transition or that have a climate component. As a whole, over 30% of EU climate spendings, of EU public spendings, must be dedicated to climate. And most of our instruments have either implemented or are implementing a do no harm principle, which means that investments that we do, the public investments that we do, cannot negatively affect sustainability objectives. And then, I'll try to move, we have the private investment aspect of it, whereby we cannot force private investors to invest differently, but we can incentivize them. So how do we do that? We make them look at the externalities that weren't considered previously. In short, it's a lot about reporting. It's a lot about transparency. And the idea is that if there is more information, then investors will consider this information and therefore change their investment decision. And all this policy that I'm going to present today on due diligence is directly related to our sustainable finance policy framework. So before I talk about corporate due diligence law, I need to talk about our corporate reporting law. There cannot be any due diligence policy if there is no reporting. You cannot do due diligence on sustainability risks and impacts if these risks and impacts have not been assessed, reported, and then audited. So our corporate reporting legislation is called the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. It applies for all companies above 250 employees, and also to listed SMEs. And under this legislation, we require these companies to start reporting on their sustainability risks and impacts in a proportionate manner. It will apply from next year for the largest companies. For SMEs, it will start applying from 2027, and even non-EU companies that have large subsidiaries in the EU will also have to report from 2029. Of course, what a large company and what a small enterprise will have to report is going to be different, because we develop reporting standards for each of these reporting entities that takes into account their capacity to report on this wide range of metrics and KPIs. So what are we requiring them to report on? Here you can see all the different reporting standards that that corporates have to report on. I work on climate policy, therefore the reporting standards that I care the most about is the first topical standards, ESRS E1 on climate change. But you can see that we have about 12 reporting standards covering other environmental considerations like pollution, water, biodiversity, circular economy, and also the social aspects and even governance. These reporting standards are mandatory, most of them, but some of the reporting standards, mostly the social and the environment ones, except climate change, are voluntary. I'll briefly highlight what the reporting standards for climate change looks like, what kind of KPIs you have to report on. You have to report on a transition plan. That's very important. So you report on whether you have a transition plan and whether that transition plan is aligned with a 1.5 degree pathway. And this is a very complicated question. So we are working internally on providing corporates with guidance so that they know how to develop a transition plan with the targets that is aligned with a 1.5 degree pathway. You have to report on your targets. Again, you have to report on your emissions. You have to report on whether you're using carbon credits, whether you're using an internal carbon pricing model. You have to report on your investments. So here we really go into the climate strategy of a company. And to conclude, this reporting, because it is quite heavy, is underpinned by a principle of materiality analysis, where we're requiring companies to only report if they consider that a particular point is material to their business. If it's not material, you don't have to report. Say if you are a small enterprise that works in the field of shoe manufacturing, and therefore you're not really causing this much greenhouse gas emissions, then you don't need to report on your greenhouse gases. So it's all a question of, is it material? Now, having done all this, is the time to talk about due diligence. So this year in the EU, we adopted our due diligence law, which is essentially implementing the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises and the UN guiding principles into EU law. So what do they require, and to whom do they apply? So they start applying from 2027 until progressively until 2029. For the largest enterprises from 2027. it really affects the really large companies. So companies over 1,000 employees and 450 billion, 450 million in revenues. So it's around 6,000 companies in the EU. And you have to do a due diligence over your supply chain. There is no climate component in the due diligence requirements, but you have to adopt a transition plan. As I was saying, talking about the corporate sustainability reporting directive, you don't have to have a report. You don't have to have a transition plan. You only have to disclose it. But here you have to adopt one. So it's a much stronger piece of legislation. Now, what do we do with this due diligence directive? The due diligence in practice is a multi-step process that requires corporates to identify their footprints, their impacts, to assess their severity, and then implement the appropriate mitigation measures to either end these impacts or to minimize them. So we're talking about investments to end these impacts, new processes. So you therefore have to have a prevention action plan. You have to have a process to receive complaints from stakeholders. And most importantly, you need to assist your business partners in dealing with the impacts. So our large companies will have to take care of their suppliers to make sure that if they have adverse impacts, they know how to deal with them. And most importantly, termination of a business relationship is only a last resort option. You can only terminate a business relationship if every other option has been looked at. You have to have tried to minimize the impacts in other ways. Otherwise, you cannot legally end business relationship on the basis of due diligence. And in that context, this is why we think that the EU due diligence law will lead to more foreign direct investments, in particular in emerging and developing countries, because you have to invest in reducing these impacts in third countries and over the supply chain. I'll end with this. We have other due diligence laws that are more sectoral. We have the EU Critical Raw Materials Act, the Conflict Mineral Regulation, we have the Battery Regulation, the Forced Labor Regulation, and the Deforestation-Free Products Regulation. These regulations are relatively new, apart from the Conflict Mineral Regulation, and they treat due diligence in a different way sometimes, where it's not a company due diligence, but a product due diligence. I will end here. Thank you very much for listening to me.